Hello and welcome to the next episode of Research Talks, a podcast series hosted by the Symbiosis Center for Research in Media and Creative Industries. I'm Dr. Ruchi Kher Jaggi, the head of the Research Center, also the dean at the Faculty of Media and Communication at Symbiosis International University. I'm very happy that the guest for today's episode is Professor Thomas Poell, who is the professor of data, culture, and institutions at the University of Amsterdam. Very happy to have you with us, Thomas.
Thank you for having me.
Let me tell you a little bit more about Thomas and his work. Thomas is co-founder of the research priority area on global digital cultures. Professor Poell's work focuses on a lot of subjects, including platforms, AI, and the transformations of culture industries. And with colleagues from around the globe, he's currently developing a research project on generative AI and creative work, which connects platform studies with the ideas from post-colonial and decolonial theory in a global perspectives program. He's also the co-author of Platforms and Cultural Production by Polity in 2022, the Platform Society published by the Oxford University Press. He's also the co-editor of the Sage Handbook of Social Media and Global Cultures of Contestation. He has published over 40 articles and edited 10 special issues in international peer-reviewed journals and serves on the editorial board of several journals, including Social Media and Society, Digital Journalism, Platforms in Society, Creator and Influencer Studies, Global Media in China, Communication and the Public, and the International Journal of Cultural Studies. Very, very honored to have you on this podcast, Thomas. Thank you so much for making time for this.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I look forward to the conversation.
So before I get into asking you some specific questions, it would be really nice to hear from you about the current work that you're doing.
I've been studying the relationship between platforms and different forms of cultural production over the last 10 years or so. And this work very much started with initial interest in journalism. So between 2010, 2015, I mostly studied the use of social media platforms in new forms of activism. And those were closely connected to alternative forms of journalism.
Okay.
So I had an initial interest in journalism. And from that interest, I started conversations with colleagues, among others with José van Dijk, who I wrote the Platform Society with, and David Nieborg, who became a close collaborator over the last 10 years. And David had been studying really the development of the game industry as it really started to change with the development of social media platforms, but also mobile gaming. And what we noticed in our conversations is that what I was observing in journalism, there were a lot of similarities with what he was observing in sort of the development of gaming, the gaming industry, as it was sort of getting accommodated in these new platform environments. So what we saw was a very strong data-driven forms of production. We saw new sort of infrastructures emerging, new business models emerging. So that was interesting. So there were similarities, but what we also saw were clear differences in these historical trajectories in which in how these cultural industries were integrating with platforms. So in journalism, historically, as you know, independence has been very, very important. So independence from political power, but also independence from sort of commercial influence,
Right.
Which was not a major issue in the game industry. The question of independence is very central to the news industry. So what we then started to do is think through how we could develop a framework to understand both the sort of the similar dynamics in these industries, as well as these different trajectories as we were observing in the two industries we were familiar with. And we were thinking that that would actually be very interesting also for people researching, for example, the music industry or the new creator industry that was emerging, or television, and so on. So that's when we developed this framework to more systematically research what we call the platformization of the cultural industries, where we argued that that transformation, the platformization process, was unfolding along what you could say 3 institutional dimensions of markets. So platforms as markets for exchanging cultural content with end users, and also connecting these users to advertisers, as infrastructures, computational infrastructures that were really structuring the work of cultural producers, and as governance frameworks that structure that work. So that's so the framework we developed, and eventually we wrote a book around basically building on that framework, also together with an American colleague, Brooke Aaron Duffy, who focuses on especially the cultural practices side of platform-based cultural production. So that's the work we've been doing for quite a few years. But eventually, while doing that work, we realized that a lot of our thinking and our theorizing was deriving from research that was taking place especially in the US and Europe, which has, of course, historically been for a long time the case, and which has also been, I think, realized as a major problem in the way our field thinks about or theorizes technology and, in our case, cultural production. So what we were missing was really perspectives from elsewhere. So we started to think about how could we really open up the conceptual debates in our field by trying to develop perspectives from other parts of the world. For example, from India or from Brazil or from Japan. So this led us to connect with colleagues who had been working or doing research in those regions, and think about how we could together develop a research project that would allow us to challenge some of the main ways in which the relationship between these technologies, platforms, but also generative AI, which was coming up over the last couple of years, how they could be theorized from these other contexts, and using those contexts not just as case studies, but as key reference points to think through or rethink sort of the conceptual language in our field. So that's where we're at right now. And that's also how we, I think, started to connect.
Yes. Yeah, very, very, I think, fascinating, interesting. And since you did refer to work from different parts of the world as points of reference, so from there, I want to ask you this next question. So do you think that this whole idea of, or the way, this whole data-driven commissioning and global formats, the way all of this is right now being emphasized, do you think all these logics are leading to more cultural homogenization, or do they allow room for diversity? What has your experience been so far?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So the relationship between sort of these datafied forms of developing content, where basically sort of signals from audiences are taken as sort of the guiding principles in the way in which new content is being developed. So the concern is obviously that would really limits the possibilities for developing diverse content, because the concern is obviously that the interest of the largest audiences would start to dominate production in any of the fields which we would be looking at. So on the one hand, there's that particular concern. On the other hand, but we're also from the beginning of the take-up of the internet, really for exchanging content, a promise has been that we're seeing the long tail, right? Is that we can the internet allows us, because it is in terms of its capacity to share content infinite or virtually infinite, allows us to share any type of content, not just the big hits, but also any type of niche content.
Right.
So that's also a promise which is connected with these technologies, and I think we can see both. So maybe that's not a satisfactory answer, but so what we can see on social media platforms like YouTube is that enormous diversity of types of content,
Right.
with any niche sort of finding its place. In a similar way, I think we can see some of these streaming platforms like Netflix, for example, commissioning all sorts of content.
Yes.
And also being quite diverse. So that diversity is there. Yet at the same time, and I think that's one of the major conclusions from the work we've been doing on platforms and cultural production, is that what we also see in these platform markets is sort of still these winner-take-all dynamics, where those producers or media organizations that are able to really also have the expertise in-house to work with the enormous wealth of data which is being generated through these platforms, to work with that data and to be able to target audiences effectively, and also that have the brand recognition, are also tend to do really well in platform environments.
Right.
So even though all that diversity is in place, we're still seeing that audiences tend to consume a relatively small set of hits.
Right.
In that sense, where the landscape is not that different from the 20th century sort of mainstream media environment, in which was also very much organized around a number of these large hits.
Yeah. I mean, very, very insightful. And that therefore brings me to my next question, which kind of also is borrowed from some of your research. Because we tend to think of platforms as places where there's a lot of democratization and access. But of course, your research has also established that this is not the case. So could you talk a little bit more about the inequalities and biases that exist in platforms, therefore?
Absolutely. So what you're referring to is the early ideas around social media platforms. So these are ideas from sort of the 2000s. So from about 2003 to 2009 or 10. So the discourse around platforms was very much one of democratization.
Right.
So the idea that indeed anyone can produce content, because basically we have the digital tools available to produce content, but also to distribute it to global audiences, because these platforms basically allow for that. Without the media organizations, or the legacy media organizations sitting in between.
Yeah.
So historically, of course, there were always these concerns that large newspapers or television channels would they curated the kinds of content where we would receive as audiences, which would have their particular biases. And the idea would be that with platforms, those biases could be bypassed and anyone could share their content. So that was the promise. But what we then see with these social media platforms is that they have all sorts of ways in which they curate content, algorithmically for an important part, sometimes also through human curation, that do privilege particular types of content. And so that's, again, that idea that these platform environments are not that different from the mainstream sort of media environments, which we know from the 20th century. So similar types of selection are taking place, even though the technical process through which that happens are different.
Right.
And that then means indeed that certain types of niche content are not becoming very visible.
Right.
So in one particular project, we look, for example, at sexual content. And for many platforms, that is types of content they do not wish to make very visible. So for people who are producing that type of content, we can observe that they're systematically discriminated. Other forms of discrimination we've also seen around creators of color. So that's there are certainly the types of forms of discrimination which we were concerned about in the mainstream environment, mainstream media environment, are still with us today with the platform environment.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And all of this then is absolutely getting impacted by the whole artificial intelligence entering this picture.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
The way
Yeah.
it has completely taken over creative economy,
Yeah.
the way it is infesting media industries. And since you also have been doing some significant work around that across multiple societies, multiple countries, how do you think, because from scripting to dubbing to marketing,
Yeah.
you see AI everywhere.
Yeah.
Do you think it is reshaping creative labor in these industries and platform industries significantly?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is really emerging research, which both of us are involved in. And what we're now doing is interviewing culture producers, especially so far in the film industry, but we're also looking into the influencer industry in Brazil, and we're talking to marketing experts in China. And what we're seeing, so we're seeing some interesting differences, but what we're also especially seeing is, well, first of all, that it's being taken up quite rapidly, partly because it offers really great new opportunities to create content. So in that sense, it opens up sort of the creative process. But there's also, in many of these contexts, a lot of pressure from media companies, media executives to use these technologies because the hope is, or the idea is, that this will save costs, right? And in many cases, that would actually mean that you can do the same kind of production with fewer people.
Yeah.
So in that sense, there is a strong pressure on sort of labor in these kinds of contexts. So that's certainly a trend which we're seeing across different geographic locations. What we're also seeing is that it tends to increase labor precarity.
Yeah.
Not just because fewer people are needed, but also because the assumption is that the same amount of work can be done in a much shorter time frame, which certainly adds to sort of the pressure on people doing that work. But what we're also seeing, and that's something we've been observing already sort of within the larger platform environment, is that the expectation on cultural producers, cultural workers, is that they are able to manage these tools by schooling themselves, right? So very few of these media companies actually offer sort of training for their employees. They assume that people will sort of manage their schooling themselves, which often takes place outside of work time.
Absolutely.
So that is extremely exhausting for people, and especially because then that's something I think many people have noticed. The way in which these models work constantly changes over time. So the moment you've sort of set up a production workflow that works in this particular moment, that can actually change within a couple of months of time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the rapid technological change is something that I think many people in the industry are struggling with.
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, this conversation actually cannot have a conclusion.
No, it can't.
Right. I mean,
Not right now.
Not right now. And there's like so much to talk about. But let me ask you one last question, right? To kind of just maybe see that, and it's always nice to close conversations on hopeful notes.
Sure.
Right? Through this conversation, discussed multiple inequalities. You talked about biases, you talked about constraints, and then, of course, we're talking about the whole pressure on creative professionals. All of this is generating, right? But in all of this, whether it is for creators or for audiences, what gives you hope about the future in a platform society?
Yeah, that's a great question. And many people have asked me this before. I think one thing, what we're observing with these platform markets is that, so it's actually quite difficult to, for also larger media companies, but also for individual creators to develop a business model that completely relies on the platform. So platforms obviously generate a lot of revenue through advertising, but what they share with media organizations or creators is relatively limited. except of course those that actually have big hits, right? So if you are able to produce content that finds a very large audience, then it becomes feasible to try to find a revenue model that actually is within the platform environment. So what we're seeing is that many actually are looking at different business models. For example, through donations, subscriptions are very important, or sponsorships which are not channeled through the platform. So that seems just to be about economics. But if you as a creator or as a media company are able to develop a different business model that also has an impact on how you produce content, because that content does not necessarily have to be driven by the interest of very large audiences or advertisers. You can actually start producing content for people who have subscribed to your content, who have a particular interest in the types of content you're producing. So that's a business model. For example, I mean, that's a very big brand, but the New York Times has very successfully built up an online subscriber base,
Right.
which means that it has arrived at a position of largely independence from these platform companies. And then it can really start catering towards these subscriber base. I think that particular business model and the types of content that you, well, as either an individual creator or media company can produce, I think is really the way forward. If you know these sets of culture producers want to remain independent from these large tech companies.
Yeah, I mean, takes a lot of courage.
It does. Yeah.
Also, I think this constant discourse on resistance that forms the core of the argument that you're making, you know, even as audiences, I think there's this continuous endeavor to resist algorithms, which at least I should confess that one miserably fails in those tests. But a lot to take away from this conversation, Thomas, and I think lots to discuss in the time to come. But thank you for these very, very overarching remarks at the moment that helps us to both get an insight into the kind of important work you are doing, how you are critically addressing it, but also helping us to think about how these concepts can be taken forward in the different conversations we have about platforms in so many contexts, including our own in India.
Absolutely. I look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining this episode today. And we look forward to having more such conversations in our future episodes. Thank you.